We have lots of museum members in attendance, but and many of them are regulars in this, but we also have a lot of the merchants who do business in the very buildings that we're going to be talking about here. And I want to thank the Three Oaks Makers and Merchants Alliance for helping spread the word about this program. We hope that some of you merchants who are here with us for the first time might consider joining the museum at some point. And I will have information on how to do that later on. So the program is in two parts. First of all, is the part that's south of the railroad tracks. We'll take a little break then, and people can ask questions about that portion of it. And then we'll go to the north end of Elm Street after that. Elm Street began just after the railroad tracks were run through this area. That's in about 1850, when Henry Chamberlain settled in what would become the village of Three Oaks. Two German immigrants, men named Henry Wehrle and Matthias Rust, cut a rough path from the railroad tracks south to what is now called US 12, but which was back then a very rudimentary road, long used by native tribes. It was known as the Sauk Trail, that eventually ran all the way from Detroit to the Mississippi River. So in the beginning, Elm Street was very rough. This early photo, taken by Fred Warren, who we're going to talk about a lot later, is from about 1870. It's looking north. That guy on the corner on the left is about where Patelli's Pizza is now. And the row of men in the far distance are standing alongside the railroad tracks. One early settler, Mick Dix Beeson by name, recalled, when we first came to town, there wasn't such a thing as cement sidewalks. Boardwalks were all we had, and you had to be careful because if you stepped on the end of a board, it would fly up and hit you in the face. The roads were almost impassable, not a particle of hard road in the township. It was said that at wet times of the year, the only places you could alight from a carriage without sinking into the mud were the railroad tracks or the grain scale. Elm Street was a dirt road until automobiles came along. 2 business blocks from Linden to Maple were paved in 1914. And you can see these World War I era troops are marching on bricks across the railroad tracks. Within a decade, the street was bricked all the way through the village. And it stayed that way until 1973, when those bricks were paved over with asphalt. So we begin the virtual tour just south of the railroad tracks, where the farmers market is held in the summertime. And that's where Henry Chamberlain built the very first commercial building in the village. Chamberlain and his partner Joseph Ames assembled a residence and a store out of pieces of buildings that had been brought in by rail from New Buffalo in 1854. For a while, this was the only business in town, and it was as much a trading post as it was an actual retail outlet. In 1920, one old-timer wrote fondly of her childhood memories of the place. The store's east and south walls had shelves with wide-mouthed glass jars of candy for sale. Pink and white peppermint drops, rock candy, great clear crystals formed on a string, and stick candies. In 1858, Samuel Donovan bought the building and made it into a hotel. For a dozen years or so, it was known as the Brown Hotel, and it had several owners during that period. But in 1871, Daniel and Mary Bombershine, also pronounced Boomershine in some accounts, bought the hotel and renamed it the Woodland House. And for decades, the Woodland House was the hub of the village. It was the village post office and a meeting place. Mary Bombershine was the daughter of James McKee, a prominent early merchant about whom we'll talk later. And she was only one of only a few female merchants in Three Oaks more than 100 years ago. She was running the hotel on her own after Daniel Bombershine died. She later remarried an old flame from 40 years earlier, Nathan Easton, and they ran the hotel together for a time. When she died in 1917, this depiction of Mary was on the cover of the Three Oaks Acorn. And believe me, it was very rare that women were getting front page coverage back then. So by 1924, the Woodland House had been demolished and replaced by Isidore Snyder's filling station, which remained there until at least the 1970s. Just to the south of the Woodland House sits this small building built in 1933. And like much of Three Oaks, it was built by the Warren family. It was constructed just after the death of Charles Warren, who was the principal heir to the Featherbone fortune that had been amassed by his late father, E.K. Charles's obituary pegged the value of his estate at $2 million, a lot of money back in 1930, much of it in land holdings in the American Southwest. Charles, who was kind of a cowboy wannabe in his younger years, that's him on the left in this painting that's at the left, which is hanging in the museum. He persuaded his father to buy up ranch land. And as featherbone manufacturing here in Three Oaks had waned, and with the Depression underway, the Warrens had sold off much of that ranch land, but they did retain the mineral rights. So that little building on Elm Street housed what was called the Warren Oil and Gas Company, a cadre of employees who fielded offers to drill on those faraway ranch lands, and then they distributed the oil company lease money to Charles Warren's descendants. Heading south now to what is called the Second Wind store at 13 South Elm. Some of you may remember that as Schwark's Tavern, which was run by the Schwark brothers from the 1940s into the 1970s. Then it was the Village Pump. And in 1989, there were two Village Pumps, one at 13 South Elm, and the other built in a warehouse near LaPorte, where some of the movie Prancer was filmed. The star of Prancer, Sam Elliott, liked the real pump, Village Pump enough so that he frequently ate there when the crew was shooting scenes on Elm Street. Going a little further south now, to what's now the Trilogy store at 17 South Elm. In the 1870s, this was the site of a pharmacy run by Dr. Hiram Wilcox, who was one of Three Oaks' first physicians. But the current building was for years a bowling alley. This shot's from a Flag Day parade. I'm not suggesting it was a bowling alley in the days of horse and wagons. But here is a shot of two gentlemen reading a sign inside that bowling alley, probably in the 1960s or 70s. And the man on the right is Ted Hellinger, one of the biggest names in Three Oaks sports history, who we'll talk about more later on. Now, south to the corner of Linden and Elm, on a 1872 map drawn by an early settler, you see the name Turner on both the southwest and northeast corners. That's Simeon Turner and his wife. We don't know her name. They were among the first folks in town after Henry Chamberlain. In 1921, one longtime resident recalled a small building on the northeast corner where Simeon Turner, a blind man, lived. He had a Negro, Tom Bach, living with him. He had a little store for cigars, tobacco, pop, and candy. Turner had been a mechanic before losing his sight. Now, on that 1872 memory map, there is a notation that Turner had a slave. Slavery was illegal in Michigan and in the rest of the Northwest Territories, but Tom Bach may or may not have been paid a living wage by the Turners. That northeast corner later became a filling station that doubled as the village's Greyhound bus station. These are photos from 1948. Across Linden Street to the south, by the way, is where Three Oaks' first gas station was built in 1918 by Nathan Bramhall. That filling station and garage were run for a long time by Earl Chick Priest, who serviced and sold Hudson and Essex automobiles. At one point, I've been told that there were 13 gas stations within the village. Now, of course, we're down to one. Across Linden Street to the south, one more note about Earl Priest. I can only find this boyhood photo of him in the Acorn. He was one of the earliest folks around here to have a radio, very likely one of these primitive copper wire models. And the Acorn reported in November of 1922, Earl expects to keep in touch with the outside world and invites his many friends out to enjoy the pleasure with him and Mrs. Priest. By the way, when the museum opens in May, we're going to have an exhibit about early radios, including that copper wire model that's on the right there. As we go back up South Elm on the west side, that corner where Zabel's Auto Repair now, 24 South Elm, was the village post office from the early 1900s to the 1950s. And next door to that, the brick building at 20 South Elm had several businesses in it at the turn of the century. A dentist, Dr. Mead, practiced above, as you might be able to see in the signage. And the G.L. Stevens grain office sign is on the awning there. Out in front is a scale for weighing the grain that farmers brought in. In 1909, by the way, a judge ordered that scale removed so the village could make street improvements. Also operating in this building for a time was Charles Bachman, a hardware dealer, seen here with his wife Charlotte and his son Ernest. Bachman, who billed himself as the farmer's friend, later moved his business to the Three Oaks Opera House, which we'll talk about later. Now, just north of there, 16 to 18 South Elm. In the 1870s, that was the Chamberlain, Warren, and Hatfield store, as you can see. The store was in 18 South Elm, and the office was in 16 South Elm next door. Now, those are big names in Three Oaks history, of course. And Henry Chamberlain and his brother William Chamberlain, who was the very first Three Oaks village president and would go on to be the warden of the state prison in Jackson, they were partners of this enterprise. Warren, of course, was E.K. Warren, Edward K. Warren. He'd worked for Henry Chamberlain in his teens, sleeping on the counter to keep watch at night. He would later win fame and fortune as the inventor of Featherbone, and he would marry Chamberlain's daughter, Mary. But we'll talk more about E.K. in a bit. James Hatfield was the third partner. He'd also worked in Henry Chamberlain's store as a teen, also slept on the store counter to keep watch, and also later married a Chamberlain daughter, Alice. Certain career path here. Hatfield would go on to work for the Warren Featherbone Company in its boom times as its first secretary and treasurer in the 1880s. In 1891, he bought out the corset division of the Featherbone Company, and he moved that part of the business to Kalamazoo. When Featherbone flourished, Warren and Hatfield left the store, and a clerk named Retta Hollett became a partner in Chamberlain, Hollett, and Bradley. Now, I have yet to find a picture of Retta Hollett, though Michigan State may have one, I just found out, and I'm going to be up at the archives there in a few days. As far as I can tell, she was the first woman to run a major Three Oaks business without having first taken it over from her husband. She was, in fact, unmarried. As her 1909 obituary put it, Miss Hollett eventually became the sole owner of the business and built up for herself a name for business integrity of which any woman might be justly proud. Judge Orville Coolidge, in his massive 1906 history of Berrien County, singled her out for praise. He wrote, "There is much written about self-made men, but before them does not lie the obstacles and difficulties which a woman encounters in the business world." And boy, did she have difficulties. Her business burned down in 1901. Her uninsured losses estimated at $6,000, the severest loss of property which had ever occurred in the village, according to Three Oaks Acorn. She rebuilt, she thrived for another decade until her store burnt down again in 1912, and she then moved her business back to her hometown of Culver, Indiana. After that, a new building at 18 South Elm housed J.W. Close's barbershop in the early 1900s. Presumably he offered a close shave. And here's John Close in his car in 1910. About a dozen years later, he would begin what appears to have been Three Oaks' first taxi service. Next door at 16 South Elm, the Rist brothers operated a grocery store at the turn of the century. You may remember that Matthias Rist had been one of the pioneers who cut down the trees to begin Elm Street 60 years earlier. In the 1940s, that grocery store was called the Royal Blue Store, and it's now the Judy Ferrara Gallery, of course. Next door, you probably recognize one of the village's most iconic structures, what we now know as Dreyer's Meat Market. But that building with the curved roof line has been a butcher shop since Englishman Alec Watson, who's in the vest in this photo, opened his market in 1875. His delivery boy, paid 25 cents a week, was Ed Dreyer, who's on the right in this picture, the little fellow there. Dreyer worked for Watson for decades. That's him behind the counter in this 1898 photo, which shows Watson with a dog in the store. In 1913, Watson, who had branched out into distilling peppermint oil and also raising cabbage, among other things, he sold his store to Ed Dreyer. And this receipt, which is actually posted in the store even now, says that for $1, Watson would throw in the fixtures and a rendering tank. So Ed and his brother Ben ran the store for many decades. I'm told the train crews used to run to Dreyer's during their stops in Three Oaks. They'd buy a steak, they'd run back to the train, they'd put the steak on a coal shovel, and then they'd put it into the locomotive firebox. Then they'd take the steak out when the train got to Galeen, the next stop, and it was perfectly done every time. That's the legend anyway. So here's Ed Dreyer cooking up some of the bologna that Dreyer's is famous for. And it was bologna later saluted in verse by Helga Sandberg, who was the daughter of the famed poet Carl Sandburg, who lived in Harvard. And she wrote, "We thank you, dear Eddie, for your bottles and basket. We've only one question, and now we will ask it. We know cheese in a tub and that liver's not bony, but how in the world do you make your bologna?" Now, that little ditty was given to Ed Dreyer Jr., who had taken over the store in 1964 from his father. Ed Sr. spent 51 years behind the counter, by the way. When Ed Jr. died in 1994, his daughter, Carolyn Dreyer, and other relatives have kept Dreyer's going strong. The Dreyer's building, built in the late 1870s, is on the National Register of Historic Places. A couple of doors to the north, where the Oaks Eatery is now, S.H. Martin ran a grocery store back in the 1800s. In the 1950s, it was called the Red and White Grocery, and it was run by Ted Dreyer. As a side note, it's very handy as somebody who does historical research to have the Dryers building with that curved rooftop, because anytime you get a street scene and you can see that curved roof, you kind of can figure out where you are. And that's not always easy to do with some of the old photos. Continuing north now to where the Harbor Country Food Pantry thrift shop is now, a low brick building with a little peak roof decoration there in the middle. It was for a long time a drugstore and much more. In the 1870s, it was run by Dr. Owen Churchill, one of Three Oaks' first physicians, and his 1866 diploma from the University of Michigan, printed on fabric, I might add, is in the museum's collection. Dr. Churchill installed the first soda fountain in Three Oaks in about 1868, and he reportedly sold $50 worth of soda water at 5 cents a glass during the first Independence Day that he was in operation. Around 1890, a fellow named Dix Beeson, a pharmacist, took over at 6 South Elm. And Beeson was a really remarkable fellow. He sold medicines, frontier remedies really, like Shiloh's catarrh remedy. I found out that catarrh is a fancy word for a stuffy nose. He sold Carl's clover root, which promised to cure not only constipation, but also clear up your complexion. It's quite a combo. Beeson's stores also sold housewares, paint, and wallpaper. He was a village president, and he held a number of other offices, including heading the Masonic Lodge. The first phone switchboard in Three Oaks was in the back of the Beeson store, starting in 1897, where there were 12 subscribers, as they called phone customers back then. Beeson's own phone number was 8. The first operator was a guy named C.P. McKee. Any guesses on whose telephone number was number 1 in Three Oaks? Well, E.K. Warren, no surprise. His son Charles was number 2, and the Oak Meadow farm that Charles ran was number 3. Dix Beeson also produced a lot of early postcards of Three Oaks, usually with this white writing on the bottom that describes the scene that you're seeing. Eventually, C.P. McKee, the fellow I mentioned, became a pharmacist himself after being the phone operator. He became Beeson's partner, and then he took over the business altogether in 1913 when Beeson decided to concentrate on farming full time. He did dairy farming and he grew peppermint very successfully. Now, a great postscript about Dix Beeson is that in 1916, he took in an African-American student from Mississippi named Jesse Otis. And Otis was the first Black student at Three Oaks High School by at least 30 years. You'll notice that's a Dix Beeson postcard of the old high school, by the way. Jesse Otis not only went on to graduate from college, but also got a master's and a PhD, and he became a university president at Alcorn State in his home state of Mississippi. When Otis graduated from Three Oaks in 1920, he wrote a letter of appreciation to the village, and he said Dix Beeson and his wife had been like parents to it. Dix Beeson died, by the way, in 1944 and is buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery. Moving north again to where Big C Lumber now stands, that area has long been used as a place to sell lumber and coal. After E.K. Warren became a mogul in the 1880s, he took over the lumber yard. And in the library, sadly, there is a photo that says Featherbone Lumber Fire, undated photo. The current building dates back to 1948. Three Oaks Lumber and Coal promised favors for the ladies and door prizes at its open house when it wanted to show off its new home. It was Cashway Lumber in the 60s and 70s and is now, of course, Big C. There used to be a structure between the lumberyard and railroad track, and if you're of a certain age, you recognize the switch building, where railroad personnel would switch tracks to ensure that trains didn't collide. And you can see that tower in the background of the World War I era photo that I showed earlier. So that is South Elm.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that my grandfather, William H. Kramer, worked in the Warren Oil building for many, many years.
Yeah, that's he did. I think he may have run that office. I remember.
Yes.
Thank you.
The folks that rebuilt the Prancer Village, they were telling me that switch house right there is still in existence. In the back of somebody's property. I believe they said it was in Harbert.
I've heard that also, and I haven't tracked it down, but I think it might even be in Lakeside, but I'm not positive.
Might be Lakeside or Harbert, but apparently it's still in somebody's yard.
Yes, I've heard that, and I haven't. It's kind of off in the woods, and I haven't kind of bushwhacked to see if I can find it.
It's on the Wilson property in Lakeside.
There we go. Yeah,
Okay.
Wilson property in Lakeside. That was,
And one more point, that Thomas Bach,
Jim.
the black guy, he joined the Civil War and he returned, and I believe he is buried out in Shed Cemetery.
oh yeah, okay.
Yep,
Well, again, he was one of the earliest residents of the village because
right. He was
Turners-
living in what's now the ambulance barn, I think, with the blind guy you were talking about.
yeah, they
He
own property
He
on,
worked for the railroad. He worked
own
for Henry
property-
Chamberlain, I think.
they own property on both sides of Elm Street. But thank you. That's Randy Miller, by the way, another museum board member. So thank you, Randy, for filling in
Yep.
some blanks. I will go ahead to North Elm. Start out with that building next to the tracks in this photo. It's the old freight house. And you can see it in the aerial photo south of what's now the library, of course. The freight house was one of the first buildings in town, as you might imagine. This 19th century photo gives an idea of what a busy spot it was. A place where farmers brought what they'd produced for shipping to market on the Michigan Central Railroad. In a 1955 book, Albert Chauncey described as a boy bringing wheat to Three Oaks. The storage bin was on the second floor of the MCRR freight house. A long plank incline led to the top of the freight house, which was a very hard pull for a horse. Now, the building was originally brought here from New Buffalo in 1854 by Henry Chamberlain and Joseph Ames, and it was kitty corner from that first in town store that they were running. It was used by the Michigan Central and then the New York Central Railroads until 1938, when it was torn down. The newspaper reported that with the demolition of the freight house, the Whittlers Club would henceforth have to meet at the train station in the summer and in Tetro's garage in the winter. So after the building was torn down, it became a park for a while, and now, of course, it's Central Avenue that goes by the library. In the background of that shot is the grandest building in town, now the library. But before it was built, there were several modest wooden buildings on the site, and this is a picture of them. The dark building on the left, as you may be able to see, was an early village post office. That tiny building is also where Frederick Parsons Warren, E.K.'s brother, published Three Oaks' first newspaper, The Reveille, in 1873. It only lasted a few months. He was a clever and self-deprecating editor. In this little ad, he tells readers that advertising in his paper is effective because the Reveille is so small, subscribers are compelled to read it through and through, advertisements and all, to get their money's worth. About the same time as he was publishing the newspaper, Fred Warren was also working on really the most amazing invention ever to come out of Three Oaks, and we'll get to that in a minute. Next to the little post office building was a larger building, the one with the awnings in this picture. And that building was Henry Chamberlain's general store, after the one in the Woodland House building. And this is where the teenage E.K. Warren slept on the counter at night, keeping watch in the 1860s. Once E.K. hit it big with his invention of Featherbone 20 years later, that building became his company's offices. Perhaps you can make out the Warren Featherbone Company written on the awning. 20 years after that, though, E.K. Warren upgraded in a very big way. The new Featherbone headquarters was designed by George Allen of LaPorte and wound up costing about $100,000 in 1905, according to Three Oaks Acorn, which the Featherbone Company owned. That paper, which was run by E.K.'s son-in-law by then, opined that the new building was more elaborate, perhaps, than the necessities of the business require, but which is erected in memory of the past and with a sentiment which embraces Mr. Warren's own business life in Three Oaks and his continued interest in the welfare of the community. The grand opening of that building in November 1906 brought 700 people on a rainy day. Warren, always interested in preserving Three Oaks history, posed a group of what the Acorn called the old standbys of Three Oaks in the grand new building. Henry Chamberlain, who was by then E.K. Warren's father-in-law, is in the far right of the back row in this photo. E.K. Warren and Featherbone were running much of the town from the offices at 3 North Elm. The telephone switchboard was moved there from Dick Beeson's drugstore. The bank run by Warren was also located here. It was where folks deposited the money that E.K. Warren had paid them in his factory. Now, here are the offices. That's E.K. Warren way in the back on the right, kind of in silhouette. The fellow in the center is E.K.'s son, Charles, who ran the Warren Agricultural Enterprises, not only the ranch that we talked about a little earlier, but also Oak Meadow Farm, just east of the village. And you may recognize a couple of those buildings, which are still standing along US 12. Charles Warren would soon get into retail in a big way, as we're going to discuss in a moment. In 1928, the bank and Featherbone offices moved out of 3 North Elm, and the Chamberlain Warren Museum which had been housed since its creation in 1916 in Henry Chamberlain's home, moved in. This is one of those displays from back then. And when in 1952, the Warren Feather Boat Company moved its operations to Georgia, the museum closed with its 80,000 artifacts shipped off to Michigan State. Within a year of that, Oscar Knoll of Benton Harbor took over the building, and he made tiny tot togs using many of the workers who had experience in making baby clothes for the Warren Featherbone Company. In 1960, Gerber bought the Knoll Company, and by 64, it had moved its operations to a plant out on US 12, the one that still stands near where Harding's Market is. In the 1970s, the Lee Company, which made audio equipment, occupied the building. You can see the company name above the front door in this 1977 Flag Day parade shot. In 1982, the Bank of Three Oaks bought the Renaissance Revival building and spent a seven-figure sum refurbishing it. It was a bank under a series of names until 1999, and the vaults, of course, are still in the building. The Township Library moved in 2000, and a revived museum, the Region of Three Oaks Museum, was put on the second floor in 2004. The museum, of course, now has its own building just west of the library. Now, next door to the north, in what is now Tom Paulie's Art Gallery, it was built as the McKee store. James L. McKee was a Mississippian who moved to Three Oaks in 1854, and he, like so many others who became prosperous merchants here, was a clerk for Henry Chamberlain and then became his partner. Unlike E.K. Warren and James Hatfield, he didn't marry a Chamberlain daughter. I'll point that out. After Chamberlain became a politician, he even ran for governor of Michigan at one point, and after Warren struck gold with Featherbone, McKee was the dean of Three Oaks Retail. That's him on the left in the picture of the store. And he was also the village president and served 2 terms in the Michigan legislature. After he died in 1915, his daughter Helen and her husband Fred Ludke took over the operation of the store. Your grandfather's store, your father's store, your store, as they said in their ads. Now, Helen Ludke was an advocate for women's suffrage and one of Three Oaks' first female elected officials. She and Maud Arnold were elected to the village council right after the 19th Amendment, which granted women the vote, took effect. But they soon quit the council, with Maud Arnold explaining, "We found ourselves at everybody's beck and call, unable to satisfy anybody and always the object of unjust criticism. It's nice just to stay at home, keep the dishes washed, and prepare the meals without having to mind anyone else's business." This story, by the way, of their resignation made nationwide headlines. Later, the McKee store was kind of covered over, as you can see, and became the Good Housekeeping shop. It was run by the Elferdinks. Gordon Elferdink ran unsuccessfully for Congress as a Democrat a couple of times. As we move north now from 9 North Elm to 15 North Elm, which is now Mooney's Ice Cream, in the late 1800s, this was the Chatterson and Ferdell hardware store. The store's huge hardware sign loomed over Elm Street, the one on the right of this picture. Joshua Chatterson was a real character, and he was very keen on keeping his prices competitive. The Acorn once reported this exchange. Mr. Chatterson happened into McKee and Warren's just after they'd made Mr. Wright a present of a jackknife. Josh, says Ed, that's Ed Warren, you can't undersell us on cutlery. Yes, we can, said Joshua. We have facilities for buying which enable us to sell cheaper than any other house in town. Mr. Wright, what did you pay for your knife? I did not give anything, said Mr. Wright. It was a present. Joshua said nothing, but he started for his store. Taking a knife from the showcase and 5 cents from the drawer, he presented them to Mr. Wright. In 1880, Chatterson and Ferdell was victimized by safecrackers. Some miscreant entered the hardware store, wrote the Three Oaks Independent newspaper, by forcing a back window, drilled a hole in the safe, put in powder and blew the lock to pieces, and taking out the money box, carried it and a sledge they found in the store down the railroad a few rods, where they used the sledge to batter open the box. Now, the burglars got away that night, but a Winfield Castler of Chicago was arrested about a month later, with his accomplices still being sought. Don't know whether they were ever found. Later, hardware stores at 15 North Elm were run by an E.G. Hamlin and by brothers-in-law named Stover and Snyder. Then, for decades after 1930, a brick building at that site was a drugstore, run first by a couple named Jordan and then by Milburn Nick Heckathorn, my favorite soda fountain as a youth. Next door to the north, now Frelick's parking lot, was the Chicago store, a very early grocery, which in the early 1900s became Portinger's, which clearly made deliveries. North of that is the big Fralix building with a long history as a department store. Built in 1910 by who else? The Warrens. The Charles K. Warren department store opened to great excitement in 1910. As you can see, the opening day crowd got all gussied up. The Warren Company had bought out the owners of the existing grocery, hardware, and clothing stores in town and put them all under one roof, installing the store owners as their department managers. They held a contest the opening week, cash prizes for farmers who brought the most customers in their wagons. And one farmer won the prize with 116 people on the back of his wagon. The department store was in fact connected to the Featherbone manufacturing complex, and there were machines operating on the second floor above the store. A clerk in the store in the 1940s, Paul Hepler, wrote, "Saturday nights were magical, the original shopping night of custom for local citizens and area farmers. I always dress as for church, shiny shoes, coat and tie for the end of the week trade, the upstairs machines quiet, bringing a civilized aspect to the business." Now, the Warrens sold the store in 1934 to John Honeyegger, who'd been running the menswear department for years. And Honeyegger brought in his kids, John, Bob, and Mary Ann, to help him run the business. His son Bob and Bob's wife Charlotte moved here from New York, where Bob had been an air traffic controller at LaGuardia. And after John Honeyegger retired in the 1950s, the family continued to run the store, keeping the look and feel of the place intact, largely anyway. Bob saying, "We tried to preserve the old look even when it wasn't fashionable." There were always Honeyegger's ads in the Three Oaks and River Valley High School yearbooks, local high school girls shopping often with proprietors' help. Bob and Charlotte Honeyegger ran Honeyegger's until 1983 when they moved to Florida. Now next door, 21 North Elm now houses village offices and other offices. This was where the Warren Bank and the Featherbone offices moved to when they left the library building in 1928. They held a big open house with Bank President Morris McGaughan showing off the new bank safe with its 10-inch thick manganese door. It was a gala affair, but it ended badly. The 61-year-old janitor died of a stroke while dancing at the celebration. Morris McGaughan was the bank president for decades, having gotten his start as a teen at the Featherbone Company. Now, in 1934, John Dillinger and his gang were terrorizing local banks. They'd gotten away from Merchants National Bank in South Bend with $30,000. So to augment those manganese safe doors, the Three Oaks Bank installed bulletproof turnstile windows and gun ports so that tellers might fire back in case of a robbery. The bank bragged to the Galene River Gazette that the new precaution would be giving the bandit one chance in a million for a daylight robbery. The bank building is at the foot of Maple Street, and I want to touch on two addresses north of Maple. First, the building on the right, which we now know as Viola Restaurant, was the site of Three Oaks' first auto repair shop. Amasa Luke and his son Roy were blacksmiths and wagon makers at that site, having moved to Three Oaks in 1904. But by 1913, Roy Luke had partnered with someone named Baker and opened the first car repair garage in the village. You might recognize the building in this shot. Above the garage, by the way, was the Masonic Lodge back in those days, and eventually the Masons also took over the first floor as well for their banquet hall. Now, just north of that building, in about 1870, stood the two-story business of Fred Warren, remember the editor of Three Oaks' first newspaper. And that's Fred, EK's brother, up on the second floor porch. On that second floor, he ran a photography business, and he also took a lot of pictures of frontier Three Oaks. This one, taken from that same balcony where you saw him sitting, shows a train running across Elm Street. And this aerial view is from the steeple of the Congregational Church out on what's now US 12. Most of the images we have of early Three Oaks are courtesy of Fred Warren. He was assisted in his photography studio by Susan Churchill, the woman in the center here, and by her daughter Ida, who's on the left. She obviously grew up before she assisted much. And they took over the photo studio after Fred Warren's death. On the first floor, Fred Warren sold jewelry and repaired watches. He was a mechanical genius. And in the back of his store, he was working on something really good, a calculating engine. He made a couple of bare bones models in the early 1870s in the back room, and they're now in the Smithsonian. In 1875, though, he finished his masterwork, version number 3, which the Smithsonian says may well have been the first working mechanical calculator made in the US. He proved that it worked in a number of public demonstrations. But within months, Fred died of tuberculosis, and his brother E.K., still 8 years from inventing Featherbone and becoming a rich man himself, did not really understand Fred's machine, and neither did anyone else. The Berrien Records obituary called Fred's invention the most ingenious calculating machine ever invented, and added, "It is so intricate as to be, perhaps, beyond the comprehension and understanding of any person or persons living." Well, that in fact did prove correct. EK couldn't figure it out, and he couldn't get anybody who understood it to help him. So the invention eventually went into the Three Oaks Chamberlain Warren Museum, and then into storage at Michigan State. It was on display at the Region of Three Oaks Museum the past 2 years, but is in the process of being returned to MSU. After Fred Warren died in 1875, Susan Churchill took over the business, becoming the first woman known to take tintype photos in the Midwest. And she also ran a boarding house in town. Fred Warren's building was torn down in 1929, and nearly 20 years later, a new building went up on that site. It was Lintner Chevrolet. Floyd Lintner had been selling cars in Galene for years and expanded into Three Oaks in 1935. His son Harlan and Harlan's son Nelson sold Chevys on Elm Street from that showroom at 104 North Elm, and sold used cars across the street until the late 1990s. Now we're going to round the home stretch and head back south on North Elm Street. At the corner of Maple, where Patelli's Pizza is now, was Godfrey Shelley's meat market around the turn of the 20th century. Shelley, sometimes also spelled Sheely with 2 E's. He was like Alec Watson. He had a dog hanging around his butcher shop. I suppose that's the way you got rid of scraps in those days. Nice place to hang out if you're a dog. Just south of Shelley's meat market was Three Oaks' other hotel of the old days, the Martin House. You see the sign on the left there. It started as a boarding house run by Thomas and Rosa Martin in 1874 and grew into a hotel. Here's a nice shot from the early 1900s with some hotel residents hanging out outside on the left, watching the street traffic go by. There was no Wi-Fi or cable TV back then, so that was the best show in town. Next door, you see the store belonging to J.W. Spinning. Spinning built that brick building and sold novelties and dry goods in it in the early 1900s, and he was a frequent advertiser in the Acorn. Later, the building became a barber shop, and then a five and dime run by an F.D. Goebel, and then by the DeWaters family, where the candy section was a huge childhood draw in my childhood. And as the sign on the front of 22 North Elm notes, Kim Pruitt's purchase of this building in 2004 led to an artists and artisans migration to Three Oaks that continues to this day. A couple of doors down, where Nelson's Saloon is now, once stood the candy store run by the Savoldi brothers, Dominic and Giuseppe, which means we're going to take a brief tour into the amazing story of Joe Savoldi. His father and uncle, as I said, ran the sweet shop and ice cream parlor in the early 1900s. Giuseppe's namesake son, nicknamed Joe, became Three Oaks' greatest ever athlete, despite not coming to this country from Italy until age 12. Joe excelled in baseball, basketball, and track, but it was his football prowess that caught the eye of Notre Dame's legendary coach, Newt Rockne. And for 2 years, there was no bigger star in college football than Joe Savoldi, an unstoppable runner of immense size for his time. He was 5'10" and 190 pounds. This sports stars of the day column had Savoldi on the left, and right next to him was Jack Dempsey and Babe Ruth. So that's not bad as a Mount Rushmore of athletic folks back in those days. He was the toast of South Bend and much of the country until it was revealed he'd been secretly married and divorced, both of them forbidden at Notre Dame back then, and he was summarily dismissed at the school from the team and the school both. He briefly played for the Chicago Bears, just a few games, but then got into pro wrestling because the money was so much better. NFL salaries were not then what they are now. He was a very glamorous wrestler. He briefly won a world title in what was probably a fixed match in Chicago. And then he wrestled overseas for a few years in Europe and Australia and New Zealand before building a home in Harbert and continuing to wrestle. When World War II broke out, Savoldi became a spy for the OSS under the alias Giuseppe De Leo. He infiltrated his native Italy just as Mussolini was being forced out of power. His adventures were later breathlessly chronicled in American newspapers. And that's the bare bones Joe Savoldi saga. We have a half-hour documentary for sale or viewing at the museum that tells a lot more. It's an amazing story. But speaking of movies, Three Oaks' first indoor cinema was right next door. The Fairyland opened in 1911. The Region of Three Oaks book, written in 1939, says Frank Lee and Clarence Parham started it. But the granddaughter of Frank Gable says that he owned it, and that his daughter Bernice played the piano as the silent movies played there, and that Frank Lee, in fact, ran the projector for Gable. Excuse me. And she gave us this photo of Gable in his car in front of the Fairyland. In any case, Frank Lee and his wife Ada would be Three Oaks movie mavens for decades, and we're going to get to them in a minute. Later on, the downstairs at 14 North Elm was home to Three Oaks' biggest supermarket, an IGA store, and now, of course, it's the Alapash Furnishing Store. The upstairs, though, has been the Masonic Lodge ever since the Masons bought the building from Frank Gable in 1923. You may remember they'd been in the Violas building before that. The Three Oaks chapter had been founded by Henry Chamberlain in 1868, and a few years back, the Masons made commemorative coins to mark the lodge's 150th anniversary of existence. Now, back to Frank and Ada Lee, who ran the theater in the Masonic building for years. Their family was blessed with talent to provide musical accompaniment in the silent film era. Ada played piano, her son Eldon played cornet, son-in-law Fred McGrath was on the banjo, and a non-family member played the violin. Ada, when asked how they'd coordinate playing movie soundtracks, answered, "We'd play slow music when the film was sad and fast music when it was exciting. We never rehearsed, we just winged." Eldon Lee and his wife, Aileen, later ran a music store next door for decades, but the Lees stopped having to provide instrumental accompaniment to their movies when the Talkies debuted at their theater in 1926. And just a few years after that, Ada inherited the building a few doors to the south, what had for decades been the Fisher Livery. Ada and Frank converted that building into a theater with 310 seats, and the first film to play the new Lee Theater in 1939 was At the Circus, starring the Marx Brothers, a comedy classic. For years, moviegoers had to go down the street to a store to buy refreshments for their movie experience. But in 1946, the Lee's daughter, Beatrice McGrath, and her husband bought a popcorn machine to the Lee Theater. Still very good popcorn there, I have to say. The next year, in 1947, Ada died, and the McGraths took over the theater until 1972, when Fred McGrath died. A couple named Gillum ran it in the 1970s, when it briefly became the Oak Theater. It served as a real estate office and a warehouse in the 80s. But in 1994, John and Jennifer Vickers bought it and rehabbed the building and reopened the movie house as the Vickers Theater. They said they put in 2,000 to 3,000 hours fixing the place up. John Vickers eventually went on to found the Indiana University Cinema, but his name, of course, is still on the theater in Three Oaks. Lastly, let's look at Three Oaks' big performing venue of the late 19th and early 20th century, the Opera House. It stood where the parking lot next to the Vickers now is. Henry Miller had built a boarding house and a saloon on that site in the 1860s. I believe that one burned down. And in 1891, the Opera House with 700 seats was built by William Bremer. The front view is behind the horses there. You can see Opera House right over the driver's head, and the side view is on the right. Now, the building probably never hosted an actual opera, but it was the site of a lot of plays and lectures and also basketball games. Three Oaks High School played its games there until a gym was built at the school in 1936. And the Three Oaks All-Stars brought some fame to the village, winning a couple of Western Michigan AAU championships in the early 1930s. The All-Stars manager and star player was Ted Hellingham, that fellow who we saw at the bowling alley a little bit earlier. That's Hellingham posing with the AAU trophy for a 1972 newspaper article. The Opera House stage and basketball venue were up on the second floor. This, by the way, is a shot from many decades later when the stage was looking quite run down. I haven't found any pictures of it in its prime, I'm afraid. On the first floor, there were businesses. In 1896, Ernest Bartlemeyer ran a grocery store there, and there was also a saloon, much to the dismay of E.K. Warren, who was a Congregationalist and frowned on drinking. He campaigned to close down that saloon and even promised that Featherbone would make up the lost saloon license revenue to the village, $250 a year. And in 1899, at his urging, Three Oaks voters voted to ban alcohol. In 1910, Warren himself bought the Opera House building, though his heirs sold it when he died a decade later. In 1938, its time as a community center was over. It was sold to the Three Oaks Co-ops and used as a warehouse. You can see broken windows upstairs in this photo of 1940 vintage. It became kind of an eyesore. It was sold to the village in 1967. The Opera House was then demolished 6 years later. The Galene River Gazette ran a lot of photos of the old building with that Cremo bread ad painted on the side coming down. And here's one that faces west, and you can see the library building in the background there. And now, of course, the Opera House site is the Vickers parking lot. Well, that concludes the tour portion of this. And before we get to questions, I just want to thank our members and encourage those of you who aren't members yet to join us. The basic family membership or basic membership is $10, $20 for a family membership, but we do accept larger donations as well. If you've enjoyed the program and want to have more programs like it produced, and if you want to be notified of future First Thursday presentations, you can send your check to that address that's on the bottom of your screen there, PO Box 121 in Three Oaks. So after that modest plug, I'm happy to answer any questions about any part of Elm Street. If you have any,
I have a little bit more information, some old family names regarding the Good Housekeeping Shop. The Sittigs bought it around 1957 when Alfred Inks moved to Florida. And then after a while, Barney Marquette had it for quite a long time in the 60s and 70s. And then it became Jenny's Antiques around the end of, I think it was around 1980. So I just wanted.
Yeah, when did the front get restored to its original look? Is that something Tom Paulie did, or maybe Tom?
No, that was more recent. That was more recent years. It just recently, the last 10 years, it has been a restaurant where they made pies. I forget the name of it.
Yeah,
and then yes, it was that, and it had been restored right before that company had purchased it. I can't think of his name, but he was an antique dealer. I'm trying to think of his name.
Well, I'm very happy that he chose to restore it.
He had a friend called the Colonel.
Okay.
But he originally did that. And I would say that was done in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it's lovely to have the original look back, I think.
Yes.
Next, in your research, you tell a story of success. The hardship is sort of left out. I'm wondering if this story of Three Oaks is a story of many small American towns, or was Three Oaks' success extraordinary? In your view, is the story of Elm Street that of many towns in America?
Well, I think so, but I would add the caveat. I think Three Oaks downtown, I think, is much more prosperous than many small towns in the Midwest, especially towns that have lost a manufacturing base, which of course Three Oaks did. And I remember talking to Carolyn Dreyer a year or two ago, and she said, it just warms my heart so much that the storefronts that were empty in the 1980s are now filled up, and their businesses there thriving, and people are doing well. So I think the answer is the development of Three Oaks probably mirrors many other towns, particularly along the railroad. That's what created Three Oaks. There's no natural reason for Three Oaks to exist. There's not a river or a crossroads particularly, but the railroad came through, and Henry Chamberlain was providing cordwood for the railroad, and that's how the town came into being. So I guess that's a roundabout answer to your question. Thanks, Tony.
I had a question. I was delighted to see in some of the pictures that there were so many people downtown. Do you know what was the population at the peak, or what was the most people, the highest population in Three Oaks?
I'm not going to be able to cite you chapter and verse what the population was. I do think that in the Featherbone heyday, it wasn't a whole lot different than it is now, the village proper. But I would probably need to do real research to say that with much assuredness. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Nick?
Yeah.
There's a photo that's run recently on the Three Oaks, one of the Three Oaks pages. I'm not sure if it's the museum page. It's a bird's eye view of Three Oaks, and it shows Joshua Chatterson's store on the east side of North Elm, just 2 doors south, I think, of what became the dime store.
Interesting. Okay, I've only, I mean, the photos I've seen pretty much place that's the big hardware sign.
Right, but
on the west
it
side.
also shows a hardware sign, and it's.
You know what? Yeah, no, that's actually,
Thinking of?
I think that's actually a separate store it was his farm implement store.
Right,
That's
okay.
right. And I think that was simultaneous to his hardware store on the other side of the street. I remember the photo you're talking about now.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, one of the stores burned, and I'm not sure which one.
I couldn't tell you that offhand. I don't remember that he had a fire, but lots of places did back then. And
Yeah.
of course, his original stores were all wood, so it wouldn't be shocking.
Right. And another thing that comes to mind, Dan and Martha Newlander had a store on the west side of North Elm. I think it was called Tiny Tots. Margaret maybe remembers.
Oh, yeah.
What time frame are we talking about?
In the 50s, I think. It was a children's store. And I think there was a women's, it was in one of the buildings. It was split down the middle, and there was a women's store on one side. I can't remember who ran it.
Yeah.
And the Newlanders.
I have no doubt of this, and I by no means claim that my little tour of Elm Street was exhaustive or complete in any way. I basically I picked the stories I thought were the most interesting, and also the things I had the most visuals of, so I could do a visual presentation. So, but yes, there were plenty of other stores that I didn't mention, and I do have some notes on actually another computer. And if I didn't talk about the business that somebody's running now, and they want to know a little more about the background of that address, I might have more information. You can either ask the question now, or it might even be easier just to email the museum email, and I'll give you whatever I have, which again is not a complete encyclopedia.
I enjoyed hearing about the Royal Blue Store.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a whole lot more about that, but what do you know?
That's my family background. I'm related to the Wrists.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, another one of the photos I'm very excited when I'm going to Michigan State, as I mentioned, next week. And another photo that I'm really interested to see is I think there's a Matthias Wrist photo there. So I'm gonna look for that. We're gonna make a lot of copies of a lot of old photographs in the archives there.
You're muted.
I have a question.
I think you muted yourself.
My grandfather worked in the building where the library is right now. And we were always told there was like a underground tunnel that went across the street. Has anybody else ever heard of that?
Nope.
I've been down in the basement of the library. I don't know about a tunnel that goes across the street, but
There's a large basement beneath the library. However, there is a tunnel underneath the Featherbone, which is currently the Generations. There is a tunnel there that runs to the Featherbone downstairs that's not seen anywhere. It's actually quite interesting. They
That
used
might be what I've
to
heard
store
about.
things, right?
yeah. Mario,
There is also a tunnel under 19 North Elm, which is now Fralix.
well,
It runs about halfway across the street.
have you been to that tunnel? Because as I said, there was an above ground passageway that was built from the second floor of 19 North Elm into the factory. I don't
No,
know.
this goes the tunnel that the workers had told me of when I was a GM of the property goes the other way. It goes across Elm.
Oh,
and only about halfway. And then it looks as though it kind of like ended.
well, interesting question. What that would have been, what they had in mind with that tunnel then. Okay.
Yeah. It goes from the basement of 19 North
Huh.
Across, like directly across Elm, not towards Featherbound, towards
Right.
right. Yeah.
To the east. Mario Z, you got your hand raised. Would you like
Yeah, there's a vault underneath Generations Drive behind Jim and Merlin Wisner's building, which actually used to be where they stored all the water to produce the steam.
That's what I was, yes.
It's a cistern, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And you can actually still get down there. They call it the cave. It's really cool.
About 2 years ago, we held the holiday party for our volunteers, the museum volunteers there, and we went down and took a tour of that. As a matter of fact, Jim was nice enough to show us down there.
Yes, really cool.
I remember going to pick up my grandmother from work after school. She worked at the Featherbone Company until she died in 1954. And so I was just a little kid, but I would go after school and remember going into Honey Acres and upstairs and taking that passageway across into the factory where my grandma worked. It's a pretty vague memory, but then we would walk home together.
Yeah, well, I had forgotten that there was ever that tunnel there until I began to read, and particularly read about the fact that there were actually factory machines on the second floor of what's now Fralix. So, yeah.
I was hoping that we could hear a little bit about the Featherbone and how Jim and Merlin had restored it and all the work that they put into it. So I was a little disappointed that they weren't included.
Well, sorry, I went Elm Street pretty much between Linden and Maple, and I did throw in a little bit about Fred Warren and that sort of thing. There are many more stories to be told. Again, I'm not claiming that what I presented here is the entire history of Three Oaks by any means.
Do you know what year the post office operated out of the building in the picture you showed us on the west side?
The one where the library is now on that.
It would have had to been before the Warren building was built, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So that was 1905 that the Warren building was built, and then the post office it moved around a little bit. It was in the Woodland House for a while, and then it was in the in that tiny little building that I showed. Then it was down at the corner of Linden and Elm Street, the northwest corner. So yeah,
there's a picture that ran in the Gazette or the Acorn, whatever it was, on an anniversary of the post office. It was like an issue about the history of the Three Oaks post office, and there's a picture of Clarence Dreyer and my great uncle James Sheldon and a couple of other people on the steps of the post office, and I think that was on the east side of North Elm. Okay. At that time, it was probably about 1912 or 13, something like that.
Yep, I believe it. I mean, it really was for a while after the Woodland House. It seemed to me it moved several times before finding a home down at the corner of Linden and Elm.
Well, from my experience in Northern Virginia, where I live, post offices tend to move to where the the postmaster lived, and postmasters used to change with the federal administration, with the president, I guess.
Right.
Because I remember the postmaster going back and forth between a Republican and a Democrat in my childhood.
Yep. No, we have a certificate of Lyndon Johnson appointing John Wood as the postmaster in Three Oaks. I know we have that at the museum.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, if there are further questions, happy to entertain them. Otherwise, I will say that our next First Thursday's program is, I think it's February 3rd. It's the first Thursday, and it's going to be about the Gulfmore Hotel, an amazing hotel in Grand Beach. A man named Tom Sues wrote a book about it, and he does a very interesting presentation. It was the second largest hotel in Michigan in its day. Very glamorous. It even had its own ski jump, as you can see here. Something of a checkered history, though. They had a lot of, they were busted often for providing both liquor and slot machines, roulette wheels, gambling. And then it burned down, shall we say, under mysterious circumstances. So it's quite a story. And in addition to Tom's presentation, the Gulf Moor is going to be part of an exhibit that we'll be doing when the museum reopens in May about local resorts. So if anybody has anything else to add here, I'm entertaining that, but otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.